Hey, welcome to Bible for Newbies. Today we're continuing our series that I've called In the Beginning. It's a series in the book of Genesis, and today we're going to be covering Genesis chapter 4. Now, this is really an important chapter because it shows us a lot about sin, and specifically it shows us how sin escalates. In this chapter, it starts with a little bit of jealousy on the part of a guy named Cain. And it grows until the entire culture is celebrating violence as a value. And there's a lot to learn here in this chapter, so I'm really glad you've joined me today. Welcome to Bible for Newbies. I'm Russ Michaels. I'm a pastor, an author, and a worship leader from Bozeman, Montana, and I love the Bible. I'm so glad you're here. This podcast is for you if you're new to reading the Bible, or if you've been reading for a while and you want to go deeper. My goal is to help untangle the confusing stuff so your Bible reading feels rewarding and life-giving, not frustrating or overwhelming. One of Jesus' disciples, Peter, wrote that the scriptures are like light shining in a dark place. I think reading the Bible is like flipping your headlights to high beam when you're driving on a dark country road. Suddenly, things get clearer, you can see the road ahead and avoid the ditches. So come take a ride with me, and let's turn on the light. Have you ever had something escalate into another thing that is way bigger than you imagined? About a year ago, my wife and I decided to remodel our kitchen, and it actually started out as a desire just for some more storage. Our cabinets were low in the kitchen, and we've got these great vaulted ceilings in our kitchen. There's all kinds of space. And so I had this brilliant idea that we just needed to add some additional cabinets above the ones that were existing. And I also wanted to install a better vent over the stove. So these were my two goals. But we ran into problems because we couldn't find new cabinets to match the old cabinets. So it ended up being an entire gut job. And of course, when you replace the cabinets, then you need new countertops, and that was a whole thing. We needed new under-cabinet lighting because the old stuff didn't work right. And then we needed new appliances, and it went on and on. Our kitchen remodel was completely out of control. And so was the price tag, as you can imagine. Now, don't get me wrong. We love our new kitchen, but it's a good example of how some things in life can just escalate out of control. Case in point, right here in Genesis chapter 4, sin. Now, you might remember from my last episode that Genesis chapter 3 is where sin entered the story. And Genesis 4, what we're going to read today, is we're going to see what sin actually does as it spreads, as it escalates. Because sin doesn't stay small. It spreads out of control. So let's jump into the first part of Genesis chapter 4. Now, before I read, I want you to know today I'm reading out of the NIV version. I did that a couple of episodes ago. And again, in this chapter, I want to read something that's a little more word for word than the NLT is. Nothing wrong with the NLT. I love it. I use it a lot. But today I'm using the NIV. And before I start reading, let me just say this. The book of Genesis was written in the Hebrew language, and the Hebrew language loves euphemisms. And there's a particular euphemism that's used here in this chapter. The first line in Hebrew says, Adam knew his wife Eve. And that word knew is a euphemism that in this version is translated made love. But that's just a little trivia that I think is fascinating. For the Hebrew language speaking people, when you know something, it's very intimate. Well, anyway, I digress. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 4. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So it's a very sad story, and you can see here how sin has escalated. But I want to stop right here and answer the question that's probably in your mind. Why did God look with favor on Abel and his offering, but not on Cain and his offering? It's a really good question, and it's an important question. So to answer this, I want us to look carefully at what the Bible actually says. What we read is that Cain brings some of the fruits of the soil. The language is very specific. I almost said suspicious, but that's the wrong word. The language is specific. Cain brings some of the fruits of the soil. Abel brings something different. Abel brings fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. And there's a difference. And this is what the difference is. Abel brings what is first and what is best. That's a big deal. It tells us that this wasn't just spontaneous generosity. It wasn't like Abel just got up one morning and said, "Hey, I feel really grateful to the Lord. I'm going to go take God an offering." Abel is clearly, there's a subtext here. Abel is responding to something God has made clear. He's bringing to God what God has asked for, and he's bringing the very best. When the Bible talks about the fat portions of a sacrifice, it's talking about the very choicest cuts of meat. Think prime rib. Think about that really, really delicious fatty ribeye steak. Those were the choicest portions of the offerings, and that was the best part when the Israelites were bringing offerings to God. And so even though that's not made explicit here in Genesis chapter 4, we understand from Bible context that Abel is bringing the very best to the Lord. Now, Cain is bringing an offering too. Good for Cain. But it doesn't carry, the language here doesn't carry that same sense of priority or obedience. It just says Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil. Now, when we go over to the New Testament, when we get over to the New Testament, it says that Abel brought his offering by faith. And faith here doesn't just mean believing in God. He's not bringing an offering because he believes. Faith in this context means trusting God enough to do what God asks him to do, even when it costs you something significant. So the difference between Cain's offering and Abel's offering here isn't farming versus ranching. It's obedience and trust. Abel trusts God, comes in faith, and he responds in obedience. And Cain, just to put it flatly, doesn't. And that's where the problem starts for Cain. Now, what I love here is that before things even get out of control, before sin escalates to murder, or before jealousy and bitterness escalates to murder, God comes to Cain. Did you catch this when I read it? God comes to Cain and he says, "Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Or some translation says it desires to overwhelm you or overcome you. Sin does. But you must rule over sin. And here's something that I think we all need to hear. Sin is not just something you do. Sin is something that wants to take over your life. And we read exactly what happened. Cain murdered Abel. Now, we're going to keep reading, starting at verse 9. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done?" "Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." And then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now, again, there's a really important question that comes up as we read this passage, and it's the question, what in the world is this mark that God puts on Cain? And if you know anything about church history, there's some pretty dark interpretations of what this means. Let me explain it to you using the Bible language and using this as our source instead of other stuff that is absolutely not true. Here's what's happening. After Cain kills Abel, God comes and confronts him. And then God acts with justice to deal with what has happened. First of all, God tells Cain that the ground will no longer yield crops for him and that he's going to be a restless wanderer on the earth. And this sounds like punishment, but that's not all it is. What's happening here is God is setting things right in a very broken situation. This is always what judgment is. It's God setting things right. So Cain is removed from this community so that the violence doesn't continue. And even the ground itself is affected by what has happened. But then Cain expresses this worry that somebody's going to come after him and kill him, and it's probably a valid concern. And so God responds in a really beautiful way. God says, listen, anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And when the Lord puts a mark on Cain, it's a mark that identifies him as protected so that nobody will kill him. So it's very important that we see this in the context of the story. The mark is not Cain's punishment. The mark is Cain's protection. And I want to be really clear here. There were Christians in I don't know, hundreds of years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, maybe, who misinterpreted this passage to suggest that the mark of Cain was about race. And that misinterpretation of Scripture, and this wasn't just a mistake, this was really a malicious interpretation of the passage. That interpretation was used to support racism in white cultures around the world. And that is absolutely wrong. There's nothing in the biblical texts that suggests that the mark on Cain was a racial mark. And it has nothing to do with punishment. The mark was not punishment, it was actually protection. And so I just want to bring this up because if you've been in any kind of a community that interpreted Genesis 4 this way, I want you to know it's a complete distortion of Scripture, and it has caused real harm in our culture. Genesis 4 is not about race. It's about God dealing with violence and at the same time actually protecting Cain's life. It's actually quite beautiful. Because what we see here is God is at the same time addressing the wrong and limiting escalation of the sin. Cain is sent away protecting other people in the community, and Cain is marked protecting his own life. That tells you a lot about God's heart. So please remember, the mark of Cain is not a mark of shame, it's a mark of mercy. Now, let's go back to the scripture and read the rest of the chapter. Verse 17. Now Cain knew his wife, or as the NIV puts it, he made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael was the father of Methushael, and Methushael was the father of Lamech. Now, I am not a Hebrew scholar, and for those of you that may speak Hebrew, please forgive me for my English interpretation of these Hebrew names. Verse 19. Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. No, I said that wrong. Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Verse 25, Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Now, let's go back. There's a whole lot on this chapter, or in this section, that I'm not going to be able to talk about. One of the things is all of these names have Hebrew meanings, and doing word studies on names is awesome, but I'm not going to do that today. I just want to go back and talk about what's happening with Lamech and his quote. Maybe you picked this up when I read it. He said, I've killed a man for wounding me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech is avenged 77 times. Now, the reason this is significant and why I want to bring it up here is because God was limiting violence with Cain. But Lamech comes along and he multiplies the violence. Lamech is not confessing sin here and saying, I killed somebody. He's actually boasting about it. And this is where you see this escalation of sin just taking over an entire culture. Cain committed a violent act. He murdered his brother. And then Lamech comes along generations later, and he builds an identity around it. And that act of murder becomes a pattern that becomes a cultural norm. And I think it's really significant here in this chapter that we see how sin escalates from something that seems small, jealousy or anger towards his brother, and it has now so infected a culture that violence is a cultural norm, and you could even say a value of Lamech's culture. But the chapter ends with this beautiful sentence. And I love how so often the Bible so honestly describes something that is tragic, like this chapter, and then it just pivots into something that is beautiful and hopeful. And that's how this chapter ends. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. And this sentence means a lot more than just saying God's name. And God's name, Yahweh, here is the Lord in this version. What this is describing is a group of people, Seth's lineage, who turns to the Lord, turns to Yahweh, calls upon him, depends upon him, seeks his presence. And so what we see here with this pivot at the very end of chapter 4 is that this chapter has these 2 directions that are emerging in parallel. There's the self-direction, the selfish direction that leads to an escalation of sin and violence. And the God direction that we're going to see leads to enhanced relationship and personal relationship with God. And I think the takeaway for us today is this. We've got to understand that sin in our lives, just like these guys that we've been reading about, doesn't stay contained. Sin spreads, but so does God's mercy. I hope you caught, as I've been walking through this chapter, that God kept interrupting the escalation of sin. He kept breaking in and saying, listen, don't do this thing. Listen, I'm protecting you. Don't escalate this thing. God just kept intervening, interrupting with mercy again and again and again. And I want to tell you, God still does this today. God interrupts my life. He's interrupting your life with a warning, with a distraction, with something that's saying, listen to my voice and don't go this direction. Be aware of the consequences. And I want to give you 4 practical takeaways today that we can apply to our lives when we're wrestling with sin or temptation, and when we become aware that sin is crouching at the door. 4 things. Here's the first one. Catch it early. Catch it early. God said to Cain, sin is crouching at your door. What he's saying is it starts small. It just starts with a small thing. It's when we linger too long on a provocative image on social media. It's thinking too much about how I was offended by that person's unkind comment. It's tailgating that rude driver and not just backing away. These are small things, but they're leading us to letting sin escalate in our lives. Number 1, catch it early. 2, listen when God speaks. I love the part of the story where God spoke to Cain before everything fell apart, before he murdered his brother, when his face was just downcast and he was angry. God came and spoke to him, trying to interrupt the process of the escalation of sin. I have lots of moments when God speaks to me. They happen all the time. I will sense God saying to me, avert your eyes, or let the offense go, or tap your brakes. And when I don't, sin in my life will escalate. I'm sure it's true for you as well. And before I know it, I've done something that I deeply regret. It's the way sin works. And here's what I want you to know. God is always speaking. And when you feel that twinge in your conscience or something in your soul that says, don't do this, take a different direction, you need to listen to what he's saying. So please remember, you've got to catch it early. And secondly, listen when God speaks. Now, here's the third takeaway. Recognize the ripple effects. Cain might have thought that his anger toward his brother was just one moment, but sadly it wasn't, because now there's effects that are not just escalating, but rippling outwardly through the generations. His brother died. Cain now is living his whole life in fear. He's separated from God. And by the time you get to Lamech, violence is being celebrated. So what feels like a moment rarely stays a moment. Somehow we have this tendency to tell this lie to ourselves that this one little thing won't matter. Nobody will know. Nobody will catch me. I can just do this one thing. But it rarely stays just a one thing. And listen, I take ripple effects in my life very seriously, because I've seen the consequences of my sin. I've seen the consequences of sin in other people's lives, and I know the destruction it causes. So I take ripple effects very, very seriously. Number 3 was recognize the ripple effects. Here's the last takeaway. Choose your direction. Lamech chooses escalation. Instead of Cain being avenged sevenfold, he decides to avenge his own offenses 77 times fold, however you would say that. Isn't it interesting that Jesus said we are called to forgive people who wrong us 70 times 7? It's really kind of a callback or a hyperlink back to Genesis chapter 4. What direction are you going to choose? Lamech chooses escalation. Seth's people begin calling on the name of the Lord, a totally different direction. Can I just ask you this simple question? Which direction will you choose? Will you let sin take over, or will you turn toward God? After all, He's the one who rescues you. He's the one who protects you. He's the one who blesses you. And in Church at Connect, I've been talking about grace the last couple of weeks. Grace just means simply God is for you. Why would you not turn to Him instead of choosing to take matters into your own hands? It's really the best advice I could give you today as a response to Genesis chapter 4. As I wrap this up, let me give you a reading invitation today, or a reading challenge. You might want to read through Genesis chapter 4 again slowly whenever you have time. But then if you want to go deeper, there's a beautiful psalm, one of my favorites again. I know I tell you all the time, all the psalms are my favorites, but this one really is. Psalm 139. There's this line in Psalm 139 that says, "Search me, O God, and know my thoughts today." Search me. It's a beautiful prayer, inviting God to look inside and reveal what's really hidden under the surface. And you could read that psalm and turn it into a prayer. And I think it'll really help you do some self-analysis and some reflection in the presence of God about where you are with the path of sin, and whether or not you're going to choose that direction or choose the direction of turning to the Lord. So let me finish. Genesis 4 was heavy. This was a heavy episode, but it's honest, and we need to hear it. Sin spreads, but sin isn't the only thing spreading. People begin to seek the Lord, and that's where the hope starts. So I'm really grateful that you've joined me on Bible for Newbies today. Boy, you would think I could say the name of my podcast accurately. Let me say that again. Thank you, friends, for joining me on Bible for Newbies today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for turning on the light with me today here on Bible for Newbies. If something in this episode brought clarity or gave you something new to think about, would you share it with a friend? You never know who else might need that same bit of light. And if you're listening on a platform where you can leave a rating or a comment, that helps more people find the podcast. And I read every comment you leave. So that's it for today. Until next time, keep walking in the light.